WBC belt that has included Ali, the greatest of all time. They are set and ready to answer who's the greatest of right now. Wilder, Fury 2, here we go.
Okay, we'll start with this. Deontay Wilder in line for a chunk of $10 million. Fury versus Joshua payout package. Discussing how he was going to explain that outlay to the top division stars, Hearn told Toe-to-Toe podcast, can you imagine that conversation when I go to Tyson Fury and Anthony Joshua and go, right, to keep all the belts on the line, I know you have to pay 3% to the governing bodies. So that's capped off the $300,000, $406,000, and that's $300,000 apiece across the four belts. That's $1.2 million.
Throw in the IBO.
It's $1.5 million, $2.3 million in total. And that's just in sanctioning fees, you understand. That's just what they have to pay the alphabets in order for all the belts to be on the line, to make it an undisputed title fight. He's quoted as saying, you've both individually got to pay the governing bodies that money. Oh, and now, Alexander Usyk wants a couple of million, 2.71 to be exact, as well. So, are you all right, lads? Just stick a couple of million out of your own pockets.
You guys keeping up?
Are you guys following? Are you guys understanding? These are the expenses. This is the kind of money that will have to be paid out to the WBC, the WBA, the WBO, and the IBF. Just as well, Usyk will require compensation, because Usyk, as we all know, is the WBO's mandatory challenger. As for Wilder, Hearn didn't mention an exact figure, but if there's a binding agreement, there's no chance it would be less than Usyk's cut. The situation means, all in, Fury versus Joshua will cost, at the very least, close to $10 million.
After everybody gets paid.
Which it may not. It could be much higher. I want to say that these are ballpark figures in reference to Usyk, in reference to Wilder. What those two fighters could be paid to stand down. What those fighters
are being compensated with.
Per a tweet from Michael Benson, Deontay Wilder versus Charles Martin is reportedly in preliminary talks. Wilder's co-manager, Shelley Finkel, has confirmed that Martin is one of several names in contention for his return. If they're not able to secure the Tyson Fury trilogy in arbitration, and for all intents and purposes, they're not. For all intents and purposes, that trilogy is off, is over with. It's done.
Why don't you move on?
Deontay Wilder stood in the way of progress in the heavyweight division long enough. Hasn't he stood in the way of an undisputed champion being brought to the division, being brought to the fight fans? Hasn't he stood in the way of that long enough?
To get the hell out of here.
Let me tell you something. It's not like the fight fans here stateside are climbing over themselves to pay for a third fight. They're not.
Nope.
Pay-per-views ain't selling like hotcakes in the United States, in case you haven't noticed. The PBC staged about three during COVID times, and neither one of the two managed to crack 300,000 pay-per-view buys.
It was 3, actually.
The Charlo doubleheader, the Gervonta Davis versus Leo Santa Cruz fight, and the Errol Spence Jr. versus Danny Garcia fight. A single one of those pay-per-view engagements managed to crack 300,000 pay-per-view buys. That being said,
you think people are in a hurry to see a three-peat?
I can tell you, as a consumer, they're not. I can tell you, as a consumer, there might actually be more money for Deontay Wilder, on a long enough timeline, of course. There might actually be more money in it for him doing something else with someone else than attempting to impose a third fight on Tyson Fury. Not that I think he can, because for all accounts, he can't. If he could have, he would have by now. But all the talk now is Anthony Joshua versus Tyson Fury. That is set to go down one way or another. And based on this sequence of events, I'm convinced there's very little that Deontay Wilder can do about it, though there is this care package, this financial compensation that needs to be reconciled. If the contract expired the way that Bob Arum said it expired, then why are they paying this guy anything?
I've asked that many times before.
The answer in and of itself will remain elusive, as certain particulars in association with this situation are going to remain in a gray area. They're not going to make all the information known to the general public, but there has to be a reason that this guy's receiving compensation of any kind.
It has to.
Why pay him at all if you don't have to? The ballpark figure, the ballpark amount, the guesstimate for what Wilder may be given as a compensation package.
Go away.
In this article, you know, what's being specified is a lot less than the previously reported $32 million. And this essentially goes back to what I told you before. $32 million ain't the kind of money you give away.
No.
Not even for a step-aside deal. Not even for a fight this size. You don't pay out $32 million for a guy to stand down. If you've got that to give away, you've got that to make the fight.
Who gives away $32 million? I think Bob Arum's going to do that.
Since the money would be coming from Top Rank, presumably it's Top Rank that Wilder's dealing with here. And you think that Top Rank would simply give away $32 million?
Don't be daft.
The article specifies a more nominal amount, something closer to what Alexander Usyk stands to make from the compensation package, $2.7 million, which is a nice chunk of change.
Yeah, I could use $2.7 million.
Yeah, me too.
I think we all could, all things considered, though. $2.7 million is a much more nominal amount than the previously specified $32 million. $2.7 million is a more reasonable, realistic figure, more in keeping with what I imagined Wilder would be getting, this compensation package, than an exorbitant, very exorbitant, $32 million? Let me paint this picture for you. Right now, the audiences, they aren't all the way back yet because the pandemic's not over. So that $16 million you got from the live gate before, it's not there for you now. And pay-per-views, they ain't selling like hotcakes. It'd be a miracle if the third fight sold as much as the second fight did. I.e., these are not ideal conditions to even try to stage the third fight. And in all likelihood, if the Wilder people have any leverage in the situation at all, they're likely using that so they don't walk away empty-handed. Maybe they don't even really want the third fight, but they want something, anything. Maybe that anything is, a little 2.7, maybe $3 million.
Remember what the deal was.
It's a 60-40 split. 60-40. If there were a third fight underway, Tyson Fury would get 60% of the proceeds, and Wilder, he'd get 40%. That's less than what he got the last time out, at a time when the fight probably won't even make as much money as it did the last time.
You think that's what they really want?
Looks to me like what the Wilder people are doing is leveraging the situation with what little leverage they might have, not necessarily to impose a third fight, but to not walk away empty-handed. They're going to get something out of it, even if it's just a paltry $2.73 million.
Well, something's better than nothing.
Though I maintain my original assertion that Deontay Wilder can't stand in the way of the big machine. He can't stop the big fight from happening. The most he can hope to do is get a couple of dollars for his troubles.
All right.
Little compensation package.
Top Rank wants to make this fight in a jiffy.
Because of that, maybe they throw you a bone. So you can get the fuck out of here. Get lost. Take a hike. Go do something with yourself.
We're busy.
In other news, Bernard Hopkins says a committed Oscar De La Hoya beats Gennady Golovkin. And, he's talking about today's Oscar, the Oscar that's been retired for years. I want to tell you something.
You better stop blowing smoke up that guy's ass.
You better stop it. Stop gaslighting him, because the worst fucking thing that could happen, is Oscar actually getting that fight with Gennady Golovkin. Let's not kid ourselves. Oscar De La Hoya, here today in 2021, in all likelihood, still has a lot of drawing power. I don't doubt for a second that an event involving Oscar De La Hoya could do considerable business. But what he doesn't need to do, what he shouldn't do, is think for a second that he can take on a world-class fighter at this age in Gennady Golovkin. That's a no-go. That's a no-fly zone. That stuff don't get off the ground here today. I'm surprised we're still even talking about this. Why are we still talking about this? I understand that Golden Boy is in a bit of a pinch. That since Canelo Alvarez isn't under the promotional banner anymore, they have to compensate for that with something, anything. And maybe that's what these conversations are. Maybe that's what this is. Maybe why they're bouncing around these ideas. But these are not good ideas.
Guy's been hitting the wacky tobacco.
You see what the Mike Tyson versus Roy Jones Jr. exhibition match did? I mean, you see what kind of numbers that brought in. And that was just an exhibition match. That was little more than just a friendly sparring session between two familiar athletes. So when you see the kind of business that an exhibition match can do, so long as familiar faces are involved, Why would you so decide to take on an actual world-class fighter, an active champion here today in your comeback fight?
Why?
Or several fights into it. You know that Oscar is not in his comeback. He's not in the phase of it that Argentina's
Maravilla!
Sergio Martinez is in. You know, Sergio is 2 fights into his comeback. And he is fighting. I mean, these are fights.
They are sanctioned bouts.
They're not exhibition matches. They are matches against pedestrian-level competition, but better still, Sergio's comeback has actually gotten off the ground. And what Sergio means to do is pin down a Ryota Murata fight late this year. When it comes to Sergio in that fight, I think the worst thing that could happen for Sergio is him actually getting that fight. That's what I think. And I think what makes more sense is for Sergio to take on Oscar. I've said it before, and I'll say it again. That fight could do considerable business for Golden Boy Promotions and DAZN.
Those 2 old guys ought to be fighting each other.
And after it's all said and done, after a victor emerges in whatever, fight they have whenever they have it, after that's all said and done, if you still got the itch, if you've still got the bug, if you've still got some stuff in the basement, okay, maybe you see about having that Ryota Murata fight, though I think it's ill-advised.
You should stay the hell away from Triple G.
Before Maravilla even geared his comeback, his then promoter, Lou DiBella, he said he didn't want to let Sergio anywhere near that animal. That animal being Gennady Golovkin. This was years ago.
I'm pretty sure Oscar was retired by then.
So that several years and several pounds later, he can entertain a fight with him? Look, I don't think this thing gets off the ground. I don't think it materializes into anything. Regardless of what's being said, Oscar can't be that fucking stupid.
Can he?
And Bernard's just being a company man. We see that all the time in boxing. Is it a coincidence that he's backing his own business partner to win a fight with Gennady Golovkin?
You're surprised?
These quotes might have given the pundits something to write about, though ultimately I don't think they're going to result in a fight. I just don't.
God forbid they do.
That's the worst fucking thing that could happen to Oscar, actually getting this fight. And finally, in super middleweight news, Eddie Hearn has said they're close to agreeing to a deal with Billy Joe Saunders for the Canelo fight in May, after Canelo faces Avni Yildirim on February 27th. As a result, he expects Demetrius Andre to defend versus his mandatory Liam Williams in March. For those not already aware, the fight has been ordered. The fight between Demetrius Andre, WBO champion, and Liam Williams, his mandatory challenger, the order for that fight has already come down. And things are working out exactly as I expected. It seemed, for a little while there, based on what was being said, that Billy intended to do both. That he intended to both take on Demetrius Andre, and if he won, take on Canelo Alvarez thereafter. That's what it was looking like. And I told you guys, that is highly illogical. That is a highly illogical course of action. Ballsy, yes.
But counterintuitive.
You get a lot of guys that like to say that Demetrius Andre hasn't fought anybody. You get a lot of guys that like to highlight that his resume is quite thin. And I agree with those sentiments to some extent, but make no mistake, I do view Demetrius Andre as a high-risk, low-reward kind of guy. Even if you guys don't, I do. You don't actually see anybody in any hurry to fight him, even though he's an active reigning world champion. Liam Williams is about the only guy trying to kick down Demetrius Andre's door for a fight. That's it. Who else do you see lining up to fight this guy? That being said, it's not a foregone conclusion that a fight between Demetrius Andre and Billy Joe Saunders ends in a Saunders win. It was a risky situation, risky enough that you could label it as counterintuitive. That if a Canelo Alvarez fight for you is right around the corner, why would you run risks with Demetrius Andre when you could potentially lose your title fighting that guy?
You lose that title, you lose that fight.
You lose what could very well be your biggest payday. Billy Joe Saunders, his resume isn't actually as thin as Demetrius's. It isn't. He's been in there with some guys, He gave Spike O'Sullivan his first professional loss, John Ryder his first professional loss, Chris Eubank Jr. his first professional loss. He won the WBO title against Andy Lee. He gave David Lemieux a boxing lesson at a time where a lot of people counted Billy Joe Saunders out. A lot of people that quite conveniently all but disappeared. And Billy has fought guys, but what Billy really hasn't had is a big fight. A big fight, a signature fight. Some might argue that his performance against David Lemieux qualifies as a signature fight.
It does?
I think that might be true in terms of performance, but
It does?
on a scale of, big fights, big marquee events, in spite of Billy Joe Saunders having been a world champion in 2 weight classes, unbeaten here today, Billy still hasn't had a big fight, a big payday. This Canelo Alvarez fight is his shot at that. And you're going to jeopardize that fight with Demetrius Andrade? For what?
What?
To defend a title you already got?
What are you, an idiot?
Such a move could be interpreted as either ballsy or quite foolhardy.
Stupid.
The resume a fighter has, their pro record, is usually a good gauge for what that fighter is capable of because you actually have a point of reference. But a resume in and of itself doesn't always tell the story. Look at what happened to Julian Williams at the hands of Jason Rosario. I don't think anybody was expecting that.
No, I wasn't.
Vasyl Lomachenko, conventional wisdom led many of you out there, myself included, to believe that Vasyl Lomachenko had what it took to beat Teofimo Lopez. Teofimo didn't have the resume that Vasyl Lomachenko had, but Teofimo won the fight nonetheless. The resume is a good gauge for what the fighter is capable of, and at what level that fighter has competed, is competing, it is. It's a very good gauge, the best.
It is.
But it doesn't always tell the story. Demetrius Andrade, in spite of having a much thinner resume than Billy Joe Saunders, is still a threat to Billy. He is. A big enough threat that, you know what? You don't want to run any risks with this guy when that Canelo fight is right around the corner.
I'm not telling you that Demetrius would beat Billy.
I'm not telling you that he wouldn't. I'm telling you it's not a foregone conclusion that either man wins. It's not a foregone conclusion that Demetrius would win, and it's not a foregone conclusion that Billy would win. That being said, when the biggest fight of your career is within sight, why would you take a chance like that now? Doesn't make sense. Ultimately, I think the aesthetic of a Andrade versus Williams fight, that's Liam Williams, his mandatory challenger, I actually think the aesthetic of that fight will be more entertaining than the aesthetic of a Saunders fight. With Saunders, it's a chess match. With Liam, he's going to push the pace and he's going to try to take you out.
He's an action guy.
Andrade versus Saunders breaks down to finesse fighter versus finesse fighter, whereas Andrade versus Williams breaks down to finesse fighter versus artillery guy, action guy, aggressive guy, physical guy, the kind of guy that's going to make you work for it.
It's a more entertaining aesthetic
Than a chess match between two finesse fighters, two cerebral southpaws in either Billy Joe Saunders or Demetrius Andrade. With Liam, you know that at least one of these guys is looking for the knockout. At least one of these guys is going to push the envelope and try to impose their will.
Not a bad fight at all.
So I'm not surprised that Billy has doubled back on those claims that he might fight Demetrius in the near future. Not surprised at all. I'm not surprised that he is prioritizing that Canelo Alvarez fight more than anything else. Why wouldn't he?